Hey, sixth grade. Mrs. Daly here. This is day 3 of distance learning, April 1st. Happy April Fool's Day. What we're going to be doing today is taking a little bit of notes. You're going to watch the screencast and listen to the screencast and fill in some missing pieces of information on a guided note sheet on the 3 kingdoms of Egypt based off of what you started yesterday in your Prezi and your sorting activity. If you haven't already, please go in and open the guided note sheet right here. Make sure that you go to File, make a copy, and save it as 3 Kingdoms Notes. There is a foldable version right here. If you have a printer, it would actually be really awesome if you'd be able to print this out, because this is the actual foldable that we would have done had we been in school. But this kind of organizes the information a little bit better for you rather than just filling it in on a Google Doc. If you don't have a printer, no big deal. Just go ahead and continue along with the guided note sheet via Google Doc because that works too. I'm going to go ahead and open up our guided note sheet, or I'm sorry, our presentation. So I'm breaking this into 2 parts. You'll do the first part today, and then you'll pick up where we left off tomorrow to finish the rest. If you remember back to the Prezi, it talked about the 3 main time periods of ancient Egypt that we call kingdoms. So we're going to start with the Old Kingdom. We'll do a little bit of the Middle Kingdom today. We'll finish the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom tomorrow. So the Old Kingdom ran from 2700 to 2200 BCE. BCE stands for Before Common Era. And we call the Old Kingdom the Pyramid Age. The Old Kingdom kind of kicked off the ancient Egyptian empire, and it began when King Menes, if you remember his name from the Time Compass video that we watched a couple weeks ago, he decided that Upper and Lower Egypt should be united. So he said, hey, Upper Egypt, come over to Lower Egypt. We will form one big old civilization, because the more people we have, the more powerful we are. And he united them, thus starting the ancient Egyptian empire and the Old Kingdom. The government of the Old Kingdom was, it was different. You had the Pharaoh, who was the ruler of all of Egypt. He was seen as a god. He was treated as a god. The people worshipped him. He lived these lavish lifestyles in these crazy rich temples with gold and marble and extravagant features. But the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom were pretty lazy. So instead of wanting to rule, they rather just kind of stay in their temples and do their own thing and enjoy their lifestyle. So what they did is they hired people to run their different city-states. And the Egyptian city-states were called nomes, not like the garden gnome, just drop the G. So nomes were scattered up and down the Nile River, and each nome had their own ruler, like a mayor, which they called nomarchs. And the nomarchs were the ones who actually did all the work. They're the ones who ran the day-to-day businesses, the economy, the agriculture, the military, trading, everything was up to the nomarchs to run their own specific nomes. While the pharaohs just kind of sat back and were relaxing and eating grapes all day, the nomarchs were the ones who were doing the hard part. So that was basically the structure of the government during the Old Kingdom. There were some really important achievements of the Old Kingdom. Most importantly is the pyramids. You think of Egypt, and one of the first things you think of are these great structures that you find in the middle of the desert in Egypt. They are still standing today. But the Old Kingdom, so only about a, very small portion of the ancient Egypt history were there actually pyramids being built. So the pyramids were only built during the Old Kingdom. They were built as tombs for pharaohs, and it was the only era during the ancient Egyptian time periods where pharaohs were actually buried into these pyramids. So the pyramids are kind of an anomaly. Scientists can't figure out, even to this day, how Egyptians were able to build these structures, because geometrically they're pretty fancy. They can't figure out how, just using simple machines, these Egyptians were able to build such great structures. And the cool thing about them is that they're still standing today. So the scientists can, of course, examine them. We as people can go visit them. It's a huge tourist attraction. And it's pretty cool because inside of these pyramids, they've found different chambers, different rooms. They've found booby traps, because remember, the pharaohs were not only buried, but they buried all of the pharaohs' belongings and riches with them in the pyramids too. So they would have to try and hide the really, really nice belongings, like the golds and the jewels and all that kind of stuff. But they didn't want robbers to get them. So they would set booby traps into these different chambers and rooms, so that it would kind of prevent people from stealing what's inside of them. But again, this was the only time period where the pyramids were built. This is the only time pyramid where the pharaohs were buried in the pyramids. And eventually they just stopped using the pyramids. I will explain to you why in just a minute. Another achievement of the Old Kingdom is that they created farming communities. They used ideas from Mesopotamia, irrigation ideas like canals and dams and levees and such, to form good and prosperous agriculture. They would use the flooding and the silt that the Nile River would deposit on the banks to grow a nice amount of crops. And eventually, with these irrigation techniques that they improved and expanded on, they are able to develop really, really good agriculture. We know when you develop your agriculture, you often have a surplus. When you have a surplus of goods, it leads to the development of trading. And eventually, they stopped trading just among themselves in their own city-states, but then they started to establish trade along the Nile. So the Nile was like a big highway of trade. They would ship goods up and down the Nile River to the different city-states, the different nomes, and you would be able to export and import goods all along that Nile River. Here's just a picture of the actual pyramids of Giza today. The pyramids of Giza are located in Lower Egypt, so the northern part up near the Nile River Delta. You can go and see these today. They are still standing. You can see the pointy, actual pyramid-shaped structures. Those are some of the most famous that you see all the time in pictures and on postcards. And whenever people mention Egypt, those each were a different pharaoh's tomb. I believe the bigger your pyramid was, the more important or the greater the pharaoh was. So these three right kind of up top must have been big shots as far as pharaohs go. And then these ones down here probably weren't as successful. This little figure pyramid, that is called the Great Sphinx. I believe it is a half lion, so it has the body of a lion, head of a pharaoh, which was probably how the pharaoh looked in real life, or they tried to make the face similar to how the pharaoh looked in real life. But these things are super cool. You can go visit them. If you ever visit Egypt, bring me back a picture. As all things do, the Old Kingdom began to decline. So the Old Kingdom began to crumble for several reasons. The first reason is that there were some political issues. There was some power struggles between the nomarchs and the pharaohs. The nomarchs started to realize, like, hey, we're doing all the work here, but we're not getting all the riches and all the glory like the pharaohs are. They're like, something's got to give. So eventually the nomarchs stopped complying to the pharaohs and the pharaoh's wishes. They started to kind of go against the pharaohs, and eventually would lead to an uprising of the nomarchs against the pharaohs. There also were some economic issues. So there were food and crop shortages because there was a drought and famine. A drought, remembers when the place doesn't get a lot of rain, so it dries out the crops. And famine is basically disease that spread across the crops, so they weren't growing crops. They weren't developing a surplus of goods. So we know when that happens, it hurts trade. So not only did they not have crops, they didn't have food to eat, they also couldn't buy and sell. So their economy began to crumble. They also added in the high cost of building pyramids. These pyramids took many, many, many years to complete, and it took a lot of manpower and a lot of materials and a lot of money to make these pyramids. And eventually, the pharaohs who were using all of the taxpayers' money to make these pyramids went broke. There were no more money to spend on these pyramids, so they made the Egyptian economy crumble as well. And then eventually, remember those nomarchs who were not happy with the pharaohs, they ended up rising against the pharaohs itself, and the pharaohs lost power completely. Which takes us into the first intermediate period. The first intermediate period was a 150-year period between the Old and the Middle Kingdom. And during that time period, it was just a time of civil war and chaos. Upper and Lower Egypt were separated again. Different nomes were fighting with each other. You had enemies with Upper Egypt fighting with enemies in Lower Egypt, and everything was just a mess. And so we call that time period the first intermediate period. It was in between the Old and the Middle. Eventually, though, a guy named King Mentuhotep came in and decided, okay, we need to reunite Upper and Lower Egypt again. So what did he do? He said, you guys of Upper Egypt, you guys of Lower Egypt, we're going to settle all our differences, and we're all going to become one happy empire again. And just so happened he was able to do that. So that started the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom ran from around 2050 to 1800 BCE and is known as the Golden Age. And it's known as the Golden Age because it was a time of stability. It was a time of prosperity. It was a time of developing Egyptian culture. So it was a really good kingdom to live in. The government of the Middle Kingdom were very different from how the structure of the government was during the Old Kingdom. In the Middle Kingdom, the pharaoh was not seen as a god. The pharaoh was seen as one of the people, and it was his role to guide and protect the Egyptians. He was supposed to be kind. He was supposed to be just. He was supposed to be wise, and instead of all powerful and just using the Egyptians to make them live a more comfortable lifestyle, the pharaohs during the Middle Kingdom were there to actually help the Egyptian people become successful. And we are going to go ahead and end part 1 here. If you need to go back, rewind. If you missed any of the information, please do so now. Don't forget to look at the rest of your lesson plan for today to finish anything else. Remember, you are not sending me your guided note sheet. Please do not share your guided note sheet with me. You're going to save that on your drive so you can reopen it tomorrow when it comes time to finish part 2. All right, unless you have any questions, I will talk to you guys tomorrow. All right, bye.